Every day, season 2 is here now. Poor Egwene doesn't want to talk a lot of sex. Hey. Okay, let's talk about juggling two things at once. Have you ever been in a situation where you think you're asking one thing, but the other person is talking about something else entirely? Well, in today's video, we'll pull apart one of the most delightful and yet creepy scenes in this episode. The uncomfy Egwene with the totally comfy in her own skin, Alanna. I'm going to have a good look at both characters and just how many things are actually going on here. Okay, ready? Let's get into it. I'm Koala Sedai and I'm just loving breaking down season 2 of the Wheel of Time, scene by scene, and sharing it with you. To have a good look at this scene, I'm going to flash in a quick look at two events that happened previously in this episode, which is firstly, Egwene walking in on Alanna and her warders in bed, and secondly, Alanna beginning the demonstration of a weave that she's teaching the novices in the kitchen. Now, looking at this scene, my first question is, did Alanna deliberately let Egwene see her with Ivan and Maxim in the hopes that it entices her towards the Green Ajah or something like that? Or is she just so truly self-absorbed that she didn't even think about, let alone notice that Egwene was in the room, let alone care even if she did notice? I mean, on the one hand, it doesn't really make any difference to the overall story arc. Or does it? Book Alanna is described as having a fiery temper and a good sense of humour, and she can quickly switch between the two. She's erratic and often does not control her emotions, which should be considered uncommon for an Aes Sedai. She's bold, daring, and certainly has a strong personality. If Alanna is truly just so self-absorbed, well, this tracks with her book character. She truly never thought about what bonding Rand without asking his consent would mean, and never really grasped how horrific it was. On the one hand, she knew that bonding without consent is not how things are meant to be done. For myself, rereading the books, I have, over the years, become more concerned and even horrified at the attitude of most Aes Sedai towards bonding men. I'm still not sure how much of this has been due to pulling apart the story layer by layer, and how much has simply come by my own, dare I say, maturing, or even maybe it's changing attitudes in the world in general. One thing I do know is that for myself, quite often I became more aware of many issues regarding the treatment and just consideration of women in society, and even of myself, through reading situations in the Wheel of Time book that were flipped so that these things were happening to men. So the whole situation of warders, let alone bonding one without consent, stood out starkly to me on rereads because it was being done to men by women. Now, if Wheel of Time world Randland had been a patriarchal society and women were being married off and expected to be subservient and not always going to this with consent, it would not have actually had the same impact, because that's something that was still then, and in some places now, is still happening to women. So when I first read these books, many women did not know in the world I was living in, as an example, that saying no to sex within marriage was okay. And that sounds astounding to say out loud in today's world. I remember being quite shocked to see early advertising by counselling agencies that were starting to make slogans about this, because it hadn't been something that I had even thought about. Still, for myself, reading of Rand being bonded was so shocking that it allowed me to start thinking more about situations women in the real world do find themselves in. But it isn't just that, it's the entire pervasive culture within the Aes Sedai. The fact that everybody accepts that these things happen. Honestly, it would appear that most Aes Sedai considered men to be beneath them, even if many formed good relationships with their warders once they bonded and were together with them for some time. Even the Greens, who apparently really liked men. Now, in The Shadow Rising, Alanna states, "I would have tied a string to each of you and even bonded you." This is when she was talking to Perrin and talking about the 3 Emondfield boys, the 3 ta'veren. To add to this, bringing it back to actual culture, not just the behaviour of one person towards another, in The Dragon Reborn, Lyanna was talking about Rand in his presence while ignoring him. "Better you don't let any Greens see this one, or one of them will bond him before he can take a breath. Greens like to bond them young." So just the fact that statements like that can be made is what makes this an entire culture, not just incorrect behaviour from one person to another. So while Lyanna was saying that to some degree as though it was a bit of a slight on Greens as well, it was also an acceptance of, well, that's just what they do. And I can tell you that when I was first reading The Wheel of Time, it was just accepted that there were a lot of things that's just what men do. I loved how we had a white male writing this series and flipping situations, like particularly flipping genders in situations, and the bond of course was not quite the same situation, but all of the inference was there, and to me it highlighted things that were happening in our real world. But I'm digressing again, and I really love doing these scene by scene breakdowns, but don't we all love how deeply into our lives the weaves of the Wheel of Time thread all through us? So out of all this digression, one of the things I'm saying is that the show is doing an amazing job of making us love Alanna from the start, and that is just going to make the impact of some of her choices later hit us even harder and really drive home some of the things that the Wheel of Time story is really telling us about. Yet I believe they're also showing us all the integral facets of her nature and her beliefs right here at the beginning in scenes like this. We see Alanna as being sensual and rather caught up in her own pleasures, and that matches with the book Alanna. She's always eating some kind of a snack that gives her a certain sensual feeling, and that did not come out of the book because it would not have had the same impact to read about and Alanna walked into the room while her warder handed her a persimmon. That wouldn't have done anything like the visual that we get of her actually doing that. Now, in The Great Hunt, when she was meant to be giving lessons to the girls, it's reported that she laughed and spent as much time talking about the world and men as she did teaching. And I just love pulling that right back to this little moment in the room here that we see with Egwene. I find it really interesting watching the show and then often hearing comments that they've changed so many things about the White Tower and how the Aes Sedai behave and what they'll tolerate, but I'm not so sure that they have. I find it fascinating to be shown things, often so quickly, rather than reading the long scenes. And don't get me wrong, I love reading the long scenes in the book, but when we're in this totally different visual medium, being shown something and getting it in a snap is brilliant. Somehow, this scene, therefore, that lasted literally seconds, and when I say this scene, I'm back to Alanna and her warders in the room, it has going to stuck in our brains forever. So, what is Alanna's intention towards Egwene? Entice her to become green, or just too self-absorbed to care about the feelings of others and about consent? Because there was a whole element of lack of consent in both the scenes of in Alanna's bedroom and now with Egwene privately talking to Alanna. Alanna obviously derived a lot of enjoyment from making Egwene squirm here by confusing what she was being asked about. I mean, her answer could be construed to work as an answer to both questions, and that's totally true. But it's her more obvious enjoyment at making Egwene so uncomfortable that strikes me. Egwene is the ultimate personification of the total desire to achieve everything perfectly. She's already feeling as though she's not being noticed at the White Tower. When in lessons, she stoically wants to prove she doesn't need to use her hands and wants to top the class. This is partly her nature, but it's also amplified by her experience with Valda, and I have talked about that in a previous episode already. Now, I would imagine that in true Wheel of Time style, she has not been talking to anyone about what happened to her. So she's experiencing her own PTSD from that first capture and torture. And she's also totally onto something important by realising that Aes Sedai are only doing their theatrics because they were taught this way. You don't need to wave your hands or dance around to channel. I love that what's really bothering her, and is her true interest, is how to work with more than one weave at a time. It's heartbreaking, really, to realise how inept the Aes Sedai are at teaching so often, both in the books and in the show. We saw how hopeless they were at helping Nynaeve break her block. Oh, some of the things they do to her in the books were literal torture. So it comes back down to the POV again, really. The books were written from the POV of country bumpkins so much of the time, especially in the early books. This means that many of the Aes Sedai were seen as imposing figures of importance and, amazing ability and strength, and they were so many things. But just look at the way the boys goggled at the big city of Baerlon, right? So we had a lot of that kind of influence in those early books. Just think about what it was like when you were at primary school and how you saw teachers, to what it was like when you were in high school and you looked at teachers, and they don't look so much older and wiser and in control of things anymore. The Aes Sedai were really the first adults they had much true connection with. Once Rand had met a few Forsaken and had been mistreated by some of the Aes Sedai, he started viewing and treating them quite differently. Once Egwene had lived with the Aiel, she saw the Aes Sedai very differently. And once Nynaeve... Nynaeve never saw them with any also. Forget that. But I was going to mention learning about the kin and their abilities and whatnot. So here we are, freshly in the White Tower, and Egwene is having a lot of her ideas shaken up from pretty much every direction. She comes here believing that she's going to be taught and that she's something special, and she finds herself right at the very bottom of things. Now, to some degrees, I've totally lost the original plot of this episode, and I don't just sit and ramble. I've actually scripted all of this out, and yet I went down so many rabbit holes and kept squirming back out and going around and around. But I'm going to now try to bring things back to some of my original thoughts. So if we look quickly again at the way Alanna is teaching this weave, she is definitely looking at weaving two different elements, which is water and earth. And this is interesting, as most women are not strong using earth. So that's why I think it's interesting that she's teaching this to novices. But still, it doesn't necessarily mean that you needed to be very strong in earth to do this weave. It may have been just more about learning about splitting weaves and concentration than strength in any of the powers. Egwene must have been dying to get this right, as we know that splitting weaves is something she is going to excel at. What I find the most heartbreaking about this whole situation is the different ways that both Nynaeve and Egwene respond to not achieving the weave in this lesson. Egwene waits for a quiet moment and approaches Alanna privately, hoping to get a little tuition or at least some tips that will get her going in the right direction. Nynaeve, on the other hand, slips down to the kitchen alone late at night, hoping that no one will know that she's going to keep trying, particularly if she fails, no one will see and know that she failed again. And yet, Egwene is pretty much mocked by Alanna, who typically is more interested in men and sex than in teaching. Nynaeve, however, is followed by Liandrin, who seizes this as an opportunity to show Nynaeve some things and then attempt to bond with her a little. Alanna does end up giving Egwene some excellent advice, however, after all of that I've been through, and I love how what she says can be applied to so many things. Egwene says, It's hard for me to focus on earth threads and the water threads at the same time. Alanna's reply is, oh, in that case, you're probably focusing on the individual grains of dirt instead of the collective mass. You're trying to use hundreds of weaves instead of just two. Now, isn't so much of life just this same way? How many times I take a situation and seeing it as being 100 things that I have to deal with all at once, and it seems too big and complicated. I still think it's tragic, though, that in a short time, Renna is going to teach Egwene so many things, and her power level is going to skyrocket. It's typical and very linked to the books. We know that basically every other culture of channelers in Randland teach the power more effectively, and the novices, or whatever the term is for the people learning the power, reach their potential. From the Sea Folk, the Aiel, to the Kin, as well as the Shonchan, let alone the Black Tower, yet the Aes Sedai are the politically powerful, open culture of channelers, and they're crippled from within. I think they're clearly showing how much trouble the White Tower is in really well in the show. My friend Kathy, who is the non-reader watching with me, is stunned at how useless they are. I notice all the signs of it being clearly shown when I reread the books now, but I admit on my first read, I thought they were awesome for quite a lot of the books. I didn't like all of them and didn't agree with them, but didn't realise completely how ineffectual they were. And again, it comes back to the early books were being told from the point of view of the country bumpkins who were just swallowing the story of how amazing they were. But once you find out how completely overridden by the Black Ajah and by Ashamel's whole thing, I'm not going to go into all of that story, but once you know all of that later, when you reread the books, all the signs are there, just like we're seeing all the signs in the show. So, where did I manage to get with my ramblings here? Hopefully, if I pull it back together in a recap, I'll feel I've been clear after all and did actually say the things that I wanted to see. So we had two situations, Egwene seeing Alanna in bed with her warders, and then Alanna teaching how to split weaves. Egwene is bamboozled by both situations and goes to Alanna alone. One thing I didn't ask is whether Egwene really was asking about the lesson and not Alanna's sex life. Do you think it's possible she was curious about that and then backed out? Okay, I won't go off on another tangent. Alanna makes Egwene immensely uncomfortable from the moment she enters and seems to take great pleasure from this. Not a good situation when she is the teacher and in a position of power. They have a stilted and strange discussion with double meanings abounding, and Egwene seems to flee the scene without really receiving any help or guidance. Or did Alanna give her exactly the answer she needed for both questions? We learned that many things are messy before they're perfect. Well, that's a fact. Maybe Alanna was being kinder than it seemed. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed this breakdown. I think I did cover what I needed to about the scene, just in the most roundabout way, but it was really fun for me to go down lots of rabbit holes. Hey, did I miss anything? Is there something you noticed going on there that harps back to, reflects, or is even a flip on something that happened in the books? I'd love to know anything else that you can see in this scene. In the meantime, please do take a moment to be sure you've liked, subscribed, shared, and comment away, either here on YouTube, over on Twitter. I love hearing your thoughts, and I love being able to think even more and more about how many threads are woven through every scene, every word, every single facial expression that we see in the show. I'll be back with more as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.